Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today what I want to talk about is the Confederate flag. In the last week we saw some progress in terms of the Confederate flag being displayed in certain public places and by certain people in our society. Two branches of the military, the Navy and the Marines, banned displays of the Confederate flag by members of the military on base or in their official capacity, and then NASCAR banned the Confederate flag from their races, which I have to say is an incredibly important step forward, I think, and a good thing. But it's a lot easier for NASCAR to ban the Confederate flag when they're not allowing any fans into the stadium, because then they only have to ban it in terms of the drivers, the cars, etc., which, to be honest with you, had already been largely done. But I want to talk to you about the Confederate flag, and in part then talk to you about the history of, not a full history of the KKK, but talk about that today as well. To begin with, that thing that people call the Confederate flag is really just one Confederate flag. As a technicality, it's considered the Confederate battle flag, and oftentimes that's because it is seen in like artistic renditions of Civil War battles. You see Confederate soldiers carrying some version of that flag with the blue cross on the red field with the white stars. That's the flag they're carrying, but that's not actually really the official flag of the Confederacy. The official flag of the Confederacy looked like this. This is what the stars and bars actually was. Now you'll notice there are only 7 stars because it's the flag that was created when the first 7 states seceded to form the Confederacy. 4 other states would follow those first 7, and then the flag would have to be reworked. And they never officially kind of said, okay, here's the new flag again, thus leading to confusion about what the Confederate flag is. So the reason why I think all this matters is because one of the things we see defenders of the Confederate flag say is that it's about heritage and not hate. Well, if it's about heritage and not hate, why not use the actual Confederate flag? Why not use the actual flag of the Confederacy instead of the Confederate battle flag? There's an answer for that. And before you go around thinking, oh, well, isn't one just as bad as the other? The answer is yes. Because when you say heritage, not hate, you are buying into the myth of what the Civil War was about. A lot of people who fly that flag and claim it's about their Southern heritage and taking pride in their Southern history will tell you that their ancestors fought for the Confederacy, and they weren't racist and they didn't own slaves. Therefore, the Civil War could not have been about slavery. The Civil War was about slavery. Every single white person in the South benefited from slavery in one way or another. Now, a lot of people are thinking, well, wait a minute, only like 25% of all white Southerners owned any slaves. That's absolutely true. Less than, probably right around a quarter of all Southerners owned any slaves. So for 25% of the population, you can see why slavery is the source of the Civil War, because as the United States grew and as we added more states, this issue of whether or not the new territories would be slave or free kept coming up, and Southern states thought if they didn't keep adding new slave states and slavery wasn't allowed to spread, that sooner or later free states would outnumber slave states in Congress and they would move to abolish slavery. So when Southern states said they wanted states to have the right to decide for themselves, what they wanted was to kind of stack the deck so there would be more Southern states with slavery, so slavery couldn't be outlawed. Even the states' rights argument is based on that. But what about that other 75%? The majority of that other 75% of Southern citizens were farmers. These were farmers who owned their own land, and they farmed it themselves. And so these are also then the men who make up the majority of the soldiers in the Confederate Army. And so it's natural then to assume, and like I probably did for some time, that my ancestors who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War weren't fighting for slavery. They were fighting for this idea of the Southern way of life and protecting their homes from the invaders. But that's not true. There's just no truth in that. White Southerners knew what the war was about. In part, they knew what the war was about because their political leaders told them what the war was about. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, gave a speech which is called the Cornerstone Speech I'll leave a link to that information below. I don't want to put his words in my video, but essentially he said the Confederacy was established on the principle that African Americans were not equal to white people, and that the proper place of African Americans in a society of white people was to be subjugated to white people. That is in the foundational documents of the Confederacy, and every state who joined the Confederacy essentially signed up for that. Texas, when Texas seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy, their secession document specifically says they're going to join their other sister slave-holding states in creating this Confederacy. Their politicians knew, their politicians told them. So people like my ancestors were aware from their politicians, but in addition to that, they were aware that slavery benefited them even if politicians didn't tell them, because they were aware of how important slavery was to the Southern economy overall. Just like you and I today are aware that the American automobile industry is important to our economy, even if we don't work for the American automobile industry, and even if we buy cars made in foreign countries or made by foreign companies, we're aware of the importance of that industry, and we don't want it to go away. White Southerners were aware of the importance of slavery, and they benefited from it. If I lived in Mississippi like my ancestors did, and I had, I don't know, let's say a 15-acre farm, primarily what I did is I was a subsistence farmer. Okay, plantation owners were, commercial farmers. They grew cash crops to make money. I'm a subsistence farmer. I grow food to feed my family. I raise animals to feed my family. But I probably also would somewhere on my land grow some cotton, let's say, because cotton is the cash crop we associate with the South the most during this time period. So I grow some cotton. So let's say I grow 2 acres worth of cotton, so I can sell that cotton and have some cash. Well, that cotton has to be sold at a market in New Orleans or some other port city. Can I afford to pay the freight to take it there? Can I afford to leave my farm and my family to go sell my 2 acres of cotton? Can I even sell that small a quantity of cotton easily? And the answer is no. So guess who I sell my cotton to? I sell my cotton to the big plantation owners who live in the area, and they just add it in with their cotton, and they have it shipped and sold and get the profits. So I depend on them to sell my cotton. In addition to that, that cotton has to be ginned. It has to go through that Eli Whitney machine which cleaned cotton. Guess who owned the cotton gins? Generally speaking, it was large plantation owners, because why would I buy a cotton gin for 2 acres of cotton? So when I want my cotton ginned, I go to the large plantation owners, and guess which workers run the cotton gin that cleans my 2 acres of cotton? Enslaved African Americans. So notice, I don't own slaves, but I am dependent on slave labor. I am dependent on those who own slaves for part of my economy. In addition to that, and what a lot of people don't know, is that there was a lively market in renting slaves. You could rent slaves from their owners. So if I wanted to rent, if I felt like, let's say I always want a bigger farm, right? Because then I can grow more cotton and more food to feed my family. There's only so much one person and family can grow. So let's say around harvest time, I think I need help. I go to the nearby slave owner, and from that slave owner, I rent an enslaved African American who comes and lives and works with me for a week or two to help me with harvesting and processing my cotton and my other crops. Am I dependent on slave labor? Yes. Do I own any slaves? No. Oftentimes, non-slave owners rented young female slaves to act as kind of servants in their home to help their wives out. Which, by the way, the slave owner liked that a lot, because then that was one less enslaved person who he had to feed, who wasn't being very productive. He could profit from that rental agreement and then get the young lady back when she was old enough to be a more productive worker. And even if I didn't do any of those things, even if I didn't own any land and I wasn't a farmer at all, the last thing, if I was a white Southerner, I wanted was more competition for jobs and land and economic opportunities. And they were well aware that if slavery came to an end, that those white people at the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder would have to compete with African Americans for jobs and land and economic opportunities. And this is all before I throw in the fact that these people were racists. Racists who feared a free African American population. So that flag, whichever one of those flags you want to talk about, represents hate. It represents racism. It represents a system designed to keep African Americans under white control for economic purposes and social purposes and control purposes. So when the Civil War comes to an end in 1865 and all the various measures are put in place to end slavery, then white Southerners primarily had to create a new system of control. And I've mentioned this before in an earlier video. They replaced slavery with Jim Crow. They replaced slavery with Jim Crow and sharecropping and lynching as a way of controlling the African American population. This is also then when the Klan comes into existence, because the Klan is a terrorist organization, which, you know, its original Klan, which was formed in 1865 and I think ends sometime in the 1870s, the original Klans, that was its job, was to terrorize African Americans, to prevent them from voting, to prevent them from demanding their equal rights, to destabilize the governments that were trying to protect them. That's what the Klan did, and guess what flag the Klan carried with them? The Confederate battle flag. So after the Civil War, it's still a symbol of hate. In 1915, the Klan was restarted in Georgia amidst a wave of anti-immigrant unrest and growing populations of African Americans outside the South. The Klan had a resurgence during which, you know, it didn't seem, a lot of people just thought of it as a pro-American group, which the KKK still positions itself as today. But they were a hate group, as they are today. They're a white supremacist group, as they are today. Okay, and guess what flag they carried? The Confederate battle flag. It has always been a symbol of hate. So then, if the flag has always been a symbol of hate, and it's always been a symbol carried by those who seek to control African Americans, who for racist reasons fear African Americans enjoying the same rights we do, how has the flag become so, you know, widely accepted and spread throughout the United States? You know, there was a picture of Donald Trump's limousines going through Maine a week or two ago, and there were people in Maine waving the Confederate flag, which, by the way, if the people who are racist carry their racist flag to wave at you when you drive by, that means they think you're racist. But anyway, so how does the flag gain that kind of, you know, acceptance around the United States? Why do so many, you know, white people in places that were actually states that fought against the Confederacy now see the flag as their symbol? Well, because it's a symbol of hate. It has been sanitized by this process of reimagining the Civil War. And the Civil War was reimagined almost immediately by an organization called the Daughters of the American Confederacy. And the Daughters of the American Confederacy were determined that the Civil War and their sons and their husbands would not be remembered as having fought a war to keep men enslaved. They wanted the war to be about anything other than slavery. So they made the war about preserving the Southern way of life. And they created this idea of, you know, Southern soldiers and Confederates, you know, being fighters for a lost cause. And that cause was noble, and they fought hard, but they lost. And this is where we get this rehabilitation, the reputation of people like Robert E. Lee, who becomes, you know, in the American mind, this kind of great general and this admirable person. That great general and admirable person owned human beings. He fought a war to keep enslavement of African Americans. That great individual committed treason. He took up arms against the United States of America. He resigned his commission in the United States Army, and he led his armies quite skillfully in battle against the armies of the United States, and in the process killed tens of thousands of American soldiers. That's who Robert E. Lee was. He's not that guy you see in the movie Gettysburg, who seems a bit, you know, goofy and mystical. But, you know, and by the way, the movie Gettysburg, for all the things that are good, by the way, the Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain parts are just excellent. All the things in the movie are good. It kind of makes the Civil War seem like this just kind of argument among friends that has nothing to do with slavery, when, of course, it has everything to do with slavery. But that popularization that we see of Lee and the Confederate generals in the movie Gettysburg, that image of them as just these kind of noble people fighting for a lost cause with a different idea about the Constitution and how the government should work, that idea is exactly what the Daughters of the American Confederacy wanted. They're the ones who begin erecting statues. They're the ones who fight for Confederate cemeteries to honor the Confederate dead. They're the ones then who create these positive images about the Confederacy during and after the Civil War. This then is picked up on by Hollywood. Most famously, D.W. Griffith in his movie Birth of a Nation, one of the first real foundational movies in American cinematic history, has the Klan as heroes because they were fighting to protect this Southern way of life. That idea of protecting the Southern way of life comes up over and over again. In the movie Gone with the Wind, there's a famous scene, I'll leave a little still picture from it right over here, in which it starts off with Olivia de Havilland, Melanie Wilkes reading Great Expectations from the beginning while their husbands are off somewhere. And Scarlett, of course, is oblivious because Scarlett only thinks about Scarlett. But she's reading this, and everybody's really nervous. And then Union soldiers come to the house looking for all these women's husbands, looking for Ashley Wilkes and Rhett Butler and Dr. Meade and Scarlett's husband, her second husband, whose name I can't remember right now. They're looking for them because they suspect they were at some kind of a political meeting, which they were. And when the men come in from their political meeting, they act like they're drunk. And they get Rhett to cover for them, essentially saying that they were at a whorehouse and not at this political meeting. That political meeting was the Klan. Ashley Wilkes was a Klan leader. That's what that's about. And that popularization, this kind of taking the racist edge off the South and what the Civil War is all about, is represented by the acceptance and the broader use of and display of the Confederate flag. But it's a symbol of hate, and it always has been. Sorry. Thank you for your patience, that long ramble about the flag. I hope that made sense. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below.